local ownership and kind of participatory research were really important rather than this kind of extractive knowledge production, and also the importance of kind of civilian agency and capacity and understanding civilians as protectors in themselves, not just people that are protected and in need of protection. Also ideas around kind of creativity and adaptability, both from the perspective of researchers that have had to adapt a lot over the kind of course of these projects for different reasons, but also that UCP practices in themselves are inherently kind of necessarily creative to keep going and change under different circumstances. And then some kind of themes that we wanted to talk, or is that for the next session, what we want to talk about more?
If it's about what kind of research gaps there are, perhaps you can talk about it now. If it's about next steps, we're going to do it in the second round.
Yes, just I guess we focused a lot of the presentations with the kind of positives and benefits of UCP, and we talked a bit about the kind of limitations and exploring them more in the context in which UCP maybe isn't possible or is more difficult. And then also we talked a lot about the language of UCP. So as was discussed, and I think other people have talked about as well, what exactly do we mean by civilian? But then also actually what do we really mean by protection? And protection in some languages, the word for protection and kind of armed defense are the same thing. So how do we kind of communicate what UCP might be? And really what protection is, actually, we couldn't really decide. Yes, and we wanted to hear more about different methods too.
Okay, so this is more or less what we want from the groups. Who wants to go next?
So on the common themes, but I think we just ended up doing all the three, but I'll just start with the common things. One of the things that we talked about was how most of the projects, or all of the projects, were looking at ethnic and religious themes, and how that's also reflective of how multicultural this region specifically is. And then we also were talking about power dynamics and how that plays into protection. We also ended up talking more about what actually is protection. Where does it end? Where does it start? How long? And we were also talking about what sort of is violence and when is that protection coming into place, at what stage of violence, and because that's something that we were talking about. And then in terms of clarifications and gaps, which also sort of went back to common themes, is I think there was discussion about having more talks about how more discussions on methodology, how it's being done, how the lessons are being drawn would actually be more interesting for people to hear, which is something that people were talking about. And also about how, because that also comes back to looking at if the methodologies, if we can look at it in a decolonizing perspective of how that methodology went on into that project and how that findings came about. So I guess more discussion on that would be very interesting to look at in the future. Yeah, there was also discussion on how, because I think that also transcends to the methodology that we're talking about, how if there's perhaps themes of what research methodologies are being used across UCP, or the principles and value systems that go into when the research is being conducted, maybe having an overarching idea of what that is would probably be also perhaps useful for projects. And then we were also talking about, the other thing we were also talking about, how this concept as such is not really, it's not really a new or an emerging thing, right? We're drawing from communities, we're drawing from existing practices from communities that are doing it on ground, and that's something that was reflected across projects in the common themes discussion we were having. And then we were also talking about how the attention on, say, the armed struggle is much higher than it is on UCP, right? That's also a theme across the region, and how that the attention, if there is more attention on UCP than it is currently on armed struggle, would perhaps be a way forward. Not in terms of resolution, but maybe in terms of finding ways to resolve conflicts, I guess. But that's pretty much on the first two. But the third, I think we're coming back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is the group happy with the representation? Yeah? I didn't ask you, group over there. Are you happy with how Louise presented it? Yeah, happy? Good. Do you want to go next?
A quick summary of our group discussion. So we spoke a bit about how seeking protection often leads to feelings of guilt and how that could be addressed. We also spoke about how polarization leads to a loss of complexity and nuance, and it is within that complexity and nuance that you can find creative ways to implement unarmed civilian protection. We also spoke about how violence has been increasingly normalized at different levels, so at the community level, and also at the national level and international level, leading to conflicts being not only normalized, but at some point also forgotten, and then maybe even denied in some cases, and how we can use UCP to shift that narrative and really challenge the idea that violence is the way. We also spoke about impartiality, which many presenters identified as a major challenge to UCP implementation. And we spoke about how it really depends on civic space. So the greater civic space you have, the more likely it is that you'll be able to observe the principle of impartiality. And so what are the opportunities for us to enable a greater civic space? And in terms of some of future research projects, we spoke about how the impacts of political socioeconomic conditions are under-researched in relation to unarmed civilian protection. Thank you. And also about how all of this is taking place within a war economy, and what does that mean in terms of grassroots level representation and spontaneous UCP. And so we also spoke about how inaccessible data is in certain contexts. It's that the very data gathering is considered a criminal activity, and how that's a challenge. And just listening to some of the observations, I may quickly add my own thought, is that also there's such a need to translate UCP methods into different languages, and how could that contribute to localizing UCP. There's certain terms that simply do not exist in different languages. Like, I'm from Lithuania, and there's no word to describe nonviolence. It just doesn't exist. So it's really tricky to explain to my family what it is that I'm doing. But for example, right? So how do we translate terms of UCP into different languages in ways that are culturally and conflict sensitive, that they make sense in specific communities?
Thank you very much. Is the group happy? Anything that happy? Good. Happiness is what we are striving for. Who wants to go next? Here, last two groups. Volunteers?
So we just took the direction literally as it was given, which was to come up with some themes that we've sort of identified through the last excellent couple of days. So thank you to all the speakers. So I'll ask the team as well to input as we go along. But there are basically 8 themes. First one is terminology. It's already been mentioned, but what do we mean by unarmed? What do we mean by civilian? What do we mean by protection? I can go on about that for a while, but I won't. Multiple perspectives, taking into account the different perspectives of all the communities, whether it's cultural, institutional, etc. The importance of identity, understanding that, inclusivity and diversity within that construct, especially within communities. Representation. Do you want to say anything about representation, Spoof? Sure. Okay. One other area which I think we should take account of, and that is post-conflict reconciliation and protection. So post-conflict, if we do get to a situation, for example, in Myanmar, where there is some sort of dialogue, some sort of process eventually, there are many people outside the country who will have to go back. And they may be seen as different for having been outside the country when they do go back. So how do we make sure they're included within that process? Because many of them have come for a good education. That education will be very useful in the future of Myanmar, but they mustn't be persecuted for that being the case. And the good example of that is the 88 revolution. Those who did come back weren't quite trusted, some of them, because they've been outside the country for some time during that struggle. But also within the community, persecution for people who they think have collaborated, or people who may be too close to the regime in some way, they also can be targeted. So trying to create a circumstance of civilian protection within that construct is not actually very easy, and we do need to think about that, I think, from now. Hope and aspiration. Do you want to say anything about hope and aspiration? Sure. I think the idea is just sort of taking into account that obviously all communities have a hope that things will be more peaceful, and they aspire to that, and it's trying to match that hope and aspiration with the reality that they face and trying to find a path to that so we can achieve it. Number 7 is a very important one, and that is defining the scope of UCP. So here we have some of the best brains in the planet all sitting around on the different tables, great ideas, and we want to design the perfect idea and concept behind UCP. And we see it as a sort of sleek racehorse, sleek flanks, very fast, can go the line, can cross over the line. But actually the reality is when we all put our input in, we're going to end up with a camel. We're going to end up with something which is designed by committee. It doesn't look pretty, but it can do the job. And that's the reality. So we need to define it so it doesn't sort of grow arms and legs. And UCP, I think most of us understand it as being the empowerment of civilians, really, that allows them to have some form of safe and secure environment within their community for whatever length of time we can arrange that for. And it will ebb and flow during conflict, but that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to do that empowerment. And we're trying to create that safe space. And it's a non-violent space. It's a space where violence is not the norm. It's abnormal. That's what we're trying to achieve. Which comes on to the final point, which is really about empowerment. And that is, so is UCP the right term? That's one question. Should it be civilian empowered protection? Because you can be violent without having weapons. You can have institutional violence, structural violence within your committee, within your village or community. You can deny somebody access to education. You can deny somebody access to resources. That's just as violent an act as somebody thumping you. And because you don't need weapons, you can thump somebody with your fist. So actually the empowerment of the community to protect each other is another way perhaps of looking at it. So those are our main points. Thank you.
Are you happy with this? Yeah? Are you happy? Good. Can I have my microphone back? Okay. Last not least.
We're Martin and I are smiling at each other because we didn't answer the question. we talked about our concerns.
There are always some students who don't listen.
Exactly. Or we listen, but we just do our own thing. That's what I used to do in school anyway. We talked about the values and the strategies of UCP and how trust and confidence came up a lot, and how the community is fragile, how trust and confidence is fragile, and relationships are fragile. And so how do we then have that trust and confidence in community, in people, and not in weaponry, and not in one-sided victory, not in military victory, and not in temporary ceasefires? Because that was one of the things that came up in the presentations, that there is less belief in unarmed civilian protection and nonviolence. And so that was one of the themes that came up recurringly. And also to make it more meaningful, not just for civilian protection, but as a way to coexist, to live with each other, to live together, and also as something that is hopeful, and sort of promoting it as something aspirational and inspirational as well. So that came up quite a lot. We also shared about autonomous AI weaponry being developed. And so how does that work when weapons are no longer manned by humans, and how would that work with civilian protection? Do we need to change the way that we protect each other? Because this weaponry is not going to recognize a human being. It's just going to do what it's programmed to do independently, yeah? And also an increase in brutality and increase in vulnerability. And so how does the community respond to an increased brutality when nonviolence seemingly, as it stands now, and unarmed protection doesn't seem to work? So how do we manage increasing brutality? And also the tools are there, the methods are there, the strategies are there. It's all in a nice booklet. But then how do we then adapt to the different contexts, and how do we implement it? How do we actually use it in day-to-day life? And then the vision of UCP gaining majority mindset, especially during armed conflict and violence. So how do we, well, I suppose in my mind, it's always like, how do we sell this? How do we convince people? How do we bring consensus? How do we share the values of it? That it is important, that it is something that we must do, that civilian protection is, like Marinal was saying, the fighters, the armed guys, you fight over there, but this bit is unarmed, this bit is the community, these are the civilians, don't touch them. How do we convince when the goal is, when we're losing over there in the armed fight, that we take it out on the civilians intentionally, like bombing Mrok U, the Rakhine, the Arakan cultural UNESCO heritage site, intentionally, because they cannot win the Arakan army military to military, right? So then how do we do that? And I think I missed one. No, it wasn't a depressing. Yeah, in the context of human rights violations and conflict and violence escalation, previously those who would be UCP sort of naturally leading this, these are those who are now having to be protected, like lawyers and advocates and human rights defenders. And so then how, because they are like seen as leaders and elders in the community, and so how do we then, and that comes back to the spontaneity as well. Yes, we protect each other spontaneously maybe, or it's thought out and it's planned, but then seeing them at risk, how do we convince ourselves and each other that stepping into this role is something that we do, and how do we keep ourselves and each other safe in doing that? Thank you. Would you like to
Is the group happy with the report? Yes. Yeah? Good. More than happy. Fantastic. This is so interesting because we just had a very similar event with the projects in Africa 3 weeks ago, right? So it was the projects from Nigeria, Cameroon, Kenya, and South Sudan, and the one project we have in Palestine. And some of the things are very similar that came out across the themes. So for example, the civilian agency, really the stressing of how civilians are not just victims that need to be protected by others and they just sit there and wait for somebody to save them, but they have agency and they use the agency and they're very creative and so on. So that is something, for example, that was observed there as well. But there were also themes that weren't mentioned here at all. And one of these big themes that was mentioned in Africa was the big challenges of climate change, and how that will create new types of conflicts, new type of problems, and how UCP might be able to help address that even before, in terms of prevention, before conflict happens. And that also tied into questions around land. There was a lot of discussion, and we had a little bit of that here in some of the projects as well. Land not just as something that is being used and it's kind of, you live somewhere and so on, but also the kind of emotional and spiritual attachments to land, and how important it is to sometimes protect the land or to protect the river as a form also of protecting your identity and protecting who you are as a community and so on. So I think there were some projects where these themes also popped up, but they were much stronger in the context that we discussed 3 weeks ago, which is quite interesting to see. While here, it was very clear the kind of the shrinking of civic space, for example, which is very important here. The huge polarization of difference, so we talked about it in Myanmar, obviously also in the context of Thailand, and how many things you can't say because they're taboo, and all these things that didn't come up so much in the African context. So I think it's very interesting to see how how at a very basic level there are themes across, but there are also kind of very regionally specific themes that come up. I don't know if you have any, sorry to call on you, because you were there as well, and you might have a better memory of things than I do. I don't know. Do you have anything?
No, my memory from it is the strong connection people felt to UCP emerging from their traditions, their cultures and traditions. So a lot of the projects very much saw that what they did wasn't a new thing. It was like part of how they just lived anyway within their communities and things. So I think that was very strongly came out across the...
No, excellent. So we will kind of write up a bit of these kind of observations from this workshop and also from the Africa workshop and share. We just haven't had enough time to do it for this one because there was so much planning still to do. But we will have an opportunity to at least kind of discuss by email or kind of share among us what these different workshops bring and what we can see. So I do want to take a few more minutes for you to think about in your groups what is the legacy of this Network Plus, right? So as I said yesterday within the welcoming, our network has fortunately received a little bit of extension to the time we have to bring our projects to an end and to do the last activities we've planned and so on. So we have until March 2025. But then this part of the community and the network building comes to a close, then we won't have any funding anymore. But it doesn't mean, or I hope at least it doesn't mean that our collaborations come to an end. So I wonder if you have ideas of what you would like to see happening after creating Safer Space winds down as a finance network. Is there something you want to do in the region? Is there something you want to do maybe at country level? Is there something you would like to see globally? And also if anyone would like to volunteer for anything, that would also be fantastic, because obviously at the moment, mainly my staff, Katja, who you will all have had some dealings with if you're the PI, or other people have been organizing things, but how can we carry this forward, and who would like to take on some tasks as well? So even just things like organizing a Zoom meeting, right? Somebody still has to set up the Zoom meeting, so that would be a good question as well. I give you some, maybe 15 minutes to discuss that, and then we bring it back together and collect a few things, and then we are done for the day. Yeah?